This is section 3 of our 1950s notes, mass culture and family life. It is exactly what it sounds like going over this. All right. As the economy began to boom in the post-war era, which we talked a lot about in these notes, Americans were no longer as concerned with saving and found themselves caught up in a wave of consumerism. That means buying as much as they could with credit a lot of times. Now, we've talked about credit in here before and how it got some people in trouble leading into the Great Depression. We talked about that when we were going over the 1920s. But now Americans really did have more money than they'd ever had before to spend in this era of history. During the 1950s, the median family income went from about $3,300 to $5,400, and I know that sounds like absolutely nothing today because prices have changed so much on everything. But just kind of take that for what it is. That's still, an increase of almost 50%. So, got to kind of look at it that way. That is twice as much as the same average family would have had in the 1920s. Companies began advertising more about buying on credit with buy now, pay later. That was General Motors. And the first ever credit card is introduced. Okay, so it was really, really easy to use credit because you had a card now. Home appliances top the list of goods that families bought in the 50s. We're going to watch a lot of stuff about this because I want, like I said, I think in a previous section, I do want you to see this stuff and not just read it on slides or listen to me talking about it. I think you really need to see all of it. So some of the appliances: washing machines, dryers, refrigerators, and new range ovens. With more money and easily accessible credit, shopping became an American pastime. Supermarkets made their appearance, shopping centers, televisions, and that's something Americans have always liked to do, only now I am just assuming most of you do your shopping online. The nuclear family, a household consisting of a mom, a dad, and their children, was considered by social scientists in the 50s to be the backbone of American economy. During World War II, women had made up about 25% of the workforce, but with war over and men returning home, many women felt pressure to return to a more traditional role, which I think I mentioned in the last section. A lot of women still worked, but that pressure they felt to be in a traditional role meant if they did still work, it was not full-time. Experts claim that the nuclear family, for it to run smoothly, women must accept their role as the child rearer and homemaker. A woman isn't a woman unless she's been married and had children, says Debbie Reynolds from The Tinder Trap. That was a TV show in the 50s. Many women are still challenged with this sentiment. And by 1960, women held a third of American jobs. That's something we can talk more about in class. It's definitely an opinion that is still around a little bit, but I think it's a much different overall outlook on what a traditional family is today, and I think that's something that's been very beneficial overall. More so than it had been in the past, family life revolved around children. Now, this is something that hasn't really changed that much. Dr. Benjamin Spock, I've got a picture on one of the next slides. You'll get to see this book. Wrote a book called Common Sense Book of Baby and Child Care. It became a bestseller. It emphasized the importance of nurturing children from infancy until their teen years. I believe parents should not worry, about spoiling their children, as they could not get too much love and attention, and it led the baby boomer generation to buy more expensive items as adults, apparently. Celebrating a religious revival. All right. In the 1950s, also witnessed a revival of religion in the United States. This is where we get names like Billy Graham. You might have heard of him before. I've got a picture of him, I think, on the next slide. Organized religious groups became more powerful and more churches were built. Regular church attendance went from 50 million to 80 million between 1940 and 1960. Anytime there's a significant cultural change, no matter what that change is, attendance or religious presence usually goes up. I will just say that. That's kind of been a trend in American history. Billy Graham I already mentioned. Attracted millions at revivals held across the nation. Roman Catholic Bishop Fulton Sheen used TV to reach audiences, and that became a very popular way of reaching audiences, which using TV, or what we would call a televangelist. And Congress added "In God We Trust" to the dollar bill. I bet you didn't know that. It wasn't added until the 50s. And the words "Under God" to the Pledge of Allegiance. This was aimed to make clear the contrast between the centrality of religion in American society and the atheism of communist societies. So, this again, kind of going back to our previous section of notes, it was very intentional in when you consider the time of American history we were in, which is the very early stages of the Cold War, and this fear of communism and the concern for it all over the world, especially in the United States in the 50s, because, we kind of talked about that when we were going over that section, but it was definitely tied to a lot of things, and religion wasn't an exception to that. All right. Okay, so there's Billy Graham over on the right, or on the left side of your screen, excuse me. And then on the right side of the screen is the baby book I told you about, Benjamin Spock's book. And then in the middle, Dr. Jonas Salk on the cover of Time magazine. So television takes center stage. This is something we'll get into more in the 60s because it really evolves and kind of becomes something that becomes very central to American culture and American history, believe it or not. But E.B. White said, "We shall stand or fall by the television." The popularity of TV shows and TVs threatened the movie industry for a little bit, as Americans would rather stay home and watch TV rather than go to the theater. That changes back. People still went to the theater, but it was the access to a television was like the shiny new toy. So the excitement of it hurt the theater industry for a little bit, but not forever. While TV attracted viewers of all ages, it has special influence on kids. Baby boomers were the first kids to grow up with the TV. Some of you guys, believe it or not, are the first ones to grow up with access to screens basically your entire life. And by screens, I mean like iPhones, iPads, computers, obviously televisions probably, but not all of us grew up that way. So, and you definitely are the first generation to grow up with Wi-Fi accessible all the time. I had internet, but it was not Wi-Fi. Arguably the most popular shows were sitcoms, though. I forgot to mention kid shows, Mickey Mouse Club, Howdy Doody. I have a Howdy Doody poster in my room. I don't know if you've ever noticed it. And The Lone Ranger. I think I've got a picture of that on the next slide. But sitcoms, I Love Lucy. I'm sure you've heard of that one. You might have heard of Leave It to Beaver. The sitcoms reflected and reinforced the idea of nuclear family of the 50s. In the 50s on television, they never showed African American characters. I say never, almost never. It changes in the 60s, but when it first came out, there weren't a lot of African American characters in the 50s. They never showed divorce, it seemed like, on these sitcoms. They never showed depression. They never showed alcoholism, etc. That's very different when you watch television today. Now they seem to show tons of diversity on whatever little shows you're watching. I don't know if it would qualify as a sitcom, probably not. But the one that I like to use as an example kind of here for the difference in what television producers are showing now compared to what they started with in the 50s is the show This Is Us with Mandy Moore. But that show, it shows such a diverse amount of people and problems and all the things. And I haven't seen the whole series, but I know people who have, and it is a very diverse show that doesn't shy away from hard things. Whereas in the 50s, they wanted to show very ideal, happy people. TV sped up the process, started by nationally broadcasted radio and news of reinforcing beliefs in cultural groups. It also changed politics, which we'll talk about when we get to the 60s. I say that. Dwight Eisenhower used it to run some political commercials, but it really changes with the first televised debate, and that's not until 1960. All right. On the left there, you've got Lucille Ball, the star of the I Love Lucy show, and in the middle, that's the Lone Ranger, and then Mickey Mouse Club. You probably knew that one already. All right, some music. Summer of 1951. I'm going to show you some video about this because you really can't talk about TV and music and movies and culture without watching it. You just can't. But Alan Freed, who was a white DJ, began broadcasting what had been known as race music, quote unquote, because it had African American roots. He started broadcasting it nationally and renamed it rock and roll. Freed unknowingly planted the seed that would change the culture of the music industry forever, and that is probably an understatement. African Americans brought their culture and music with them as they moved from the South. Rock and roll borrowed heavily from rhythm and blues, aka R&B, in case you know that's what that stood for. It used to be called the boogie woogie. It says it used to be called blues, it used to be called rhythm and blues, and it's called rock now. That's Chuck Berry. If you don't know who Chuck Berry is, I've got a picture of him on the next slide, and I've got some videos so you can hear some of his music. Live performances of R&B have been kept separate in the South due to Jim Crow laws, which are segregation laws, if you don't remember. We kind of talked about Jim Crow for the first time. Elvis Presley was heavily influenced by R&B and African-American gospel tunes because of where he grew up, and I think he just had probably good taste. And Sam Phillips, who owned a recording station in Memphis, heard Presley and helped him break through to stardom, which did in his story. There's always the Elvis movie, I guess you could watch, which probably does a decent job of telling it. All right, there's Elvis on the left, 1957, Chuck Berry in the middle, and then B.B. King. I didn't mention him on the slide previously, but that's B.B. King on the right, great musician. Like I said, we'll watch some stuff and listen to some of this music because you really can't read about it. You have to hear it, you have to see it. So that's it for section 3. We've got one more section for this chapter. It's a very short one, and that will wrap us up for the 50s, and then we will move on to the civil rights movement in the 1960s.